The earliest assassination conspiracy theory emerged nearly 200 years ago with the assassination attempt on 7th President Andrew Jackson. On January 30th, 1835, President Jackson was leaving a funeral when a man emerged from the crowd and attempted to shoot him. The pistol misfired. He threw it down and tried again with a second pistol, but it too misfired. By this point, the 67-year-old president was striking the man with his cane. Jackson was pulled away, and a crowd swarmed the would-be assassin, beating him on the ground. In the midst of the chaos, Jackson shouted, "Let me alone! I know where this comes from." He believed it was orchestrated by his political opponents. Jackson was an incredibly controversial president due to his stances during the nullification crisis, the Indian Removal Act, and his opposition to the Second National Bank. Furthermore, his handling of executive powers were considered tyrannical, the most popular example being his outright defiance to the rulings of the Supreme Court. He was the first president to truly be an outsider, as the first 5 presidents were all founding fathers, and the 6th president the son of a founding father. Jackson was different in thinking, background, and politics. And he was no stranger to conspiracy theories. The first time he ran for president, he lost, despite winning the popular and the electoral vote. He believed that his enemies had conspired to keep him out of the White House, a theory which historical consensus considers true. Clashes and scandals during his first and second term would only serve to affirm his beliefs that his enemies would stoop to any level to stop him. One of these enemies was his own former vice president, John C. Calhoun. Calhoun served as vice president through most of Jackson's first term. However, their relationship eventually fell apart due to matters ranging from political to personal. Things got so bad that Calhoun resigned months before his term could even finish, being one of only 2 vice presidents to do so. For Jackson's second term, Calhoun had returned to the Senate, where he became one of Jackson's fiercest opponents. Weeks before the assassination attempt, Calhoun had reportedly called Jackson a Caesar who ought to have a Brutus. Jackson was also suspicious of Senator George Poindexter of Mississippi, a former ally and friend who'd turned on him over time. Like Calhoun, he'd use vicious language to attack Jackson in the Senate. It was soon learned that the assassin actually had a connection to Poindexter. 35-year-old Richard Lawrence was a house painter by trade. Months earlier, Lawrence had painted Poindexter's house, and at least one person recalled seeing the two talking. Immediately after the attack, Calhoun made a public statement denying any involvement, whereas Poindexter only doubled down. Americans throughout the polarized nation came to believe Jackson's conspiracy theory. Even Vice President Martin Van Buren, who'd replaced Calhoun in Jackson's second term, was on guard. He began equipping 2 pistols every time he entered the Senate building. Upon investigation, it became clear that Lawrence was severely mentally ill, and the conspiracy theories lost traction. While in custody, Lawrence told investigators that he was King Richard III and that he owned estates in England, and that Jackson's meddling with the National Bank had prevented him from getting his money transferred. He referred to Jackson as King Andrew, and as such claimed that Jackson was an impostor of his own rightful throne. It was also learned that Lawrence had recently lost his job, and that he blamed this on Jackson too. The doctors interrogating Lawrence then asked who told him this. He couldn't directly identify anyone in particular, but he did say that he often attended the debates in Congress. It's also worth noting that the title King Andrew was one used by many in the emerging Whig Party. This led some who didn't necessarily believe the conspiracy theory to believe that Lawrence was a Whig extremist, but investigators and doctors eventually settled on a less sensational story. They believed that Lawrence was simply mentally ill, not only due to his outlandish claims, but also due to his bizarre behavior, such as being completely calm in the face of potential legal consequences for his actions. They believed that after Lawrence left his job, he began spending his time watching debates in Congress, where he heard rhetoric about Jackson being responsible for the country's economic troubles. It's also possible that he heard the inflammatory language being used against Jackson by the likes of Calhoun, such as his statement about Jackson needing a Brutus. At the time, politics in Washington were intensely bitter. It wasn't uncommon for violent remarks to be made off the cuff, but Lawrence seemed to take them literally. Also, the Whig's title, King Andrew, likely fit right into Lawrence's delusions, since he had thought of himself as the rightful king for years leading up to this point. Lawrence was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and no evidence of a larger conspiracy was ever found. Senator Poindexter's career, however, wouldn't recover. Mississippi voters believed Jackson's theories, and Poindexter lost in his election bid for a second term. Though not part of the conspiracy theory, there was another extraordinary theory around the case. Lawrence fired on Jackson with 2 separate pistols, and both failed to discharge. Afterwards, investigators tested the pistols, and they repeatedly fired just fine. The chances of both pistols misfiring was calculated to be 125,000 to 1. To Democrats, this was a sign that their party had God's favor. This is just part 1 in a series on conspiracy theories about presidential assassinations. Part 2 will be looking at Zachary Taylor. Taylor officially died of a stomach ailment, but to this day, some people believe he was poisoned. Upcoming videos will discuss Lincoln, Garfield, Harding, and Kennedy. To support this channel, consider subscribing and donating on Patreon. Patreon link in the description below.